Okay, we're going to continue our work today with graphing quadratic functions. In our last two lessons, we were focusing on the key feature that is the vertex. In this lesson, you can see we're going to focus on finding either a maximum or a minimum value by looking at a graph or an equation. So our do now is just to think about how would you define the words maximum and minimum in your own words. So just take a moment to think about that and then we'll discuss. Okay, so hopefully you've heard the word maximum and minimum just in different contexts other than just math class. For maximum, I think about the greatest or maybe the largest. So for example, on most tests, we say that the maximum score that you can get is 100. So maximum usually means the biggest or the greatest or the largest. The opposite of that would be a minimum. So minimum here would be the smallest or the least. So the example we usually give is like if you need a minimum of a 65 to pass your class, that is the lowest or the smallest grade that you can get. So we're going to use that idea of a minimum and a maximum in today's lesson. For today's lesson, you should be looking at your graphing quadratic functions packet on page 8. So our notes here say every parabola has either a highest point or a lowest point, which as we learned in the last two lessons, we call the vertex or a turning point. The y-coordinate of the vertex is the maximum or the minimum value represented by the parabola. So again, if we can identify the vertex and pick out the y-coordinate, we'll be able to identify our maximum and our minimum. In this box right here, they just give you a little hint for how to identify the maximum or minimum by comparing it back to standard form. So remember that standard form is y equals ax squared plus bx plus c. And the hint that they're giving to you here has to do with the a value. So if the a value is greater than 0, meaning that the a value would be positive, that means that the parabola opens upward. It looks like a U, and then you'll have a minimum value. If your a value is less than 0, which means your a value would be negative, that means that your parabola is upside down. It opens downward, and in that case, you have a maximum value. So in these parabolas, you cannot have both. You're going to either have a maximum or you're going to have a minimum. So if we look at these examples in example 2, again, if you can identify the vertex, you are able to find your maximum or minimum value. If we look at example A, our vertex right here is at 1, 5. Since this parabola is upside down, that means that we have a maximum value because it's the highest. And again, the maximum would be 5 because we said that it is the y-coordinate of our vertex. In example B, this time our vertex here is -2, -5. But this time our parabola is opening upwards, which means we have a minimum because that's our lowest value. And again, it's the y-coordinate of -5. So in example A, the largest y value we have is 5. That's our maximum. In example B, the smallest y value we have is -5. So that's our minimum. Looking at an equation here, we remember that we can identify the vertex as HK, meaning it's the opposite of what's inside the parentheses and then the number at the end from our equation in vertex form. So in example C, our vertex would be -1, -6. Because this a value out front here is positive, that means our parabola opens upward, which means that we would have a minimum value. And again, the minimum is that y-coordinate of the vertex, which is -6. In example D, we have a vertex here of 4, 5. And again, because that a value out front here was negative, if we were to graph this, that would mean that our parabola is upside down. So that means that our vertex here would represent a maximum, and the y-coordinate is 5. So let's think about our turn and talk question just to summarize. It says, how can you find the minimum and maximum on a graph and an equation? So if we think about the graph, we're going to say that it's going to be the highest or the lowest point, depending on if it's a maximum or minimum. And then more specifically, it's the y coordinate of the vertex. Looking at an equation, if we remember from our last two lessons, we were talking about our vertex form. As a reminder, vertex form, y equals a parentheses x minus h squared plus k. And we know here that our h and our k represent the vertex. And we know that the maximum or minimum is the y value. So this number on the end here is going to always represent our maximum or our minimum. So let's take a look at our guided practice at the bottom of page 8. At this point, I'd like you to try to pause the video, answer these two questions, and then come back to check your work. So in our first guided practice problem here, I notice here that the vertex of this equation is, this graph rather, is right here at 3, -1. Because this is an upwards facing parabola, this represents the lowest point of my graph. So that means that it represents a minimum. And as we learned in our mini lesson, the maximum, or in this case, the minimum, is always the y coordinate of our vertex. So that would be -1. Okay, looking at our example in the right side right here, I notice again, because I have this negative sign, that means that our parabola is upside down. So that means that my graph would look like this if I were to graph. If you want to confirm this, you can go ahead and graph using the online graphing calculator. And I know that the vertex would be right here. Identifying the vertex from our vertex form here, it's the opposite of h in the inside parentheses and then k right here. So our vertex would be +5, +8. So again, because this graph is upside down, that means that our vertex here represents a maximum because it would be the greatest value on the graph. And the y coordinate of our vertex here would be 8. Okay, so again, when you're looking for the maximum and minimum, you want to think about, does the graph face upwards or downwards to figure out, is it the greatest or the least value? Then you identify the vertex and focus specifically on the y coordinate of your vertex. So let's go ahead and try our checkpoint question here. You don't have to copy this graph down. Please just pause the video, go and answer numbers 1 and 2, and then come back to check your work. Okay, so for this checkpoint question, number 1 here says, does the graph have a maximum or a minimum? You should have answered minimum, because this point right here represents a lowest point on the graph. I can see here that the coordinates of this vertex right here would be at -3, 2. So we know that for the second question, to find that value of the minimum, we take the y coordinate of our vertex, which would be 2, because +2 is the smallest y value that we see on our graph. So for number 1, you should have answered minimum. For number 2, you should have answered the number +2. So reflecting on how you did on that checkpoint question, here are your directions for the independent practice. If you were not able to answer either of those parts of the checkpoint correctly, please start in red. If you were able to answer one part correctly, either 1 or 2, please start in yellow. And if you answered both parts correctly, please start in green. Again, you need to do at least one group's worth of practice, either red, yellow, or green, to get your credit for this lesson. Also, everyone should notice here that you are now able to do 2 more problems in your Regents packet, number 11 and number 15. So please pause this video, go and practice for at least 10 to 15 minutes on your assigned questions, then come back here to check your work. Okay, at this point, you should only be listening if you've already tried these and you're ready to check your work. Here is numbers 1 through 5 on page 9. Feel free to pause the video to check your work. Here is numbers 6 and 7, also on page 9. Moving on to page 10, here's number 8. Here is number 9 on page 10. Moving on to page 11, here's question number 10. And moving to the bottom of page 11, here's question number 11. So at this point, to get your classwork credit for this lesson, please go back into Google Classroom and submit a picture of your checkpoint question as well as whichever independent practice problems you completed. If you still feel like you want additional support or guidance on this lesson, feel free to watch the Khan Academy video that I posted on Google Classroom or reach out to us to get extra help. Finally, to finish off this lesson, you should go back to exit ticket 8.3 and answer question number 2. Again, you don't have to submit this yet until we've done the entire exit ticket, but at this point, you know how to do question number 2.